Funding for Inner Compass is provided by Calvin College.
The life that's unfolding,
the world that awaits,
gifts that are yours to explore,
and God's to use.
It's all happening here at Calvin.
Welcome to Inner Compass. I'm Karen Saupe. Every year, up to 4 million Americans make short-term mission trips out of the country. And churches now spend as much money on those trips as they do on long-term missionary programs. Is that a good use of our resources? Our guest today has asked that question, and he has suggestions for ways that we can give of ourselves more fully and effectively in mission work. Join us on Inner Compass.
From the campus of Calvin College, this is Inner Compass, exploring how people use faith and ethics to guide them through critical issues of today.
My guest today is David Livermore, Executive Director of the Global Learning Center at Grand Rapids Theological Seminary and author of the book Serving with Eyes Wide Open, Doing Short-Term Missions with Cultural Intelligence. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
Short-term mission trips have become really a privilege and a habit with especially middle and upper class churches. It's kind of Christian vacation, maybe. Your book mentions that 29% of high schoolers, American high schoolers, have made such trips. And the goal is to fix something or someone, to bless others somehow. It seems like a good project, but maybe a mixture of charity and self-refinement. That is, there's something to be gained, hopefully some learning. Another thing we might consider is the financial cost of short-term mission trips. Is it fair to say $1,000 to $2,000 per person?
Yeah, and progressively growing.
Okay. Why not do these mission trips in one's own town? Why is that not more popular?
Yeah, great question. I think part of the shift reflects that missions trips initially started primarily in the youth ministry arena.
Yes.
And the sense was, yes, there's no question that there are needs in our hometowns, but if you take them somewhere else, it's going to more alert them to the needs that are back in their hometown. And so the driving assumption was, let's take them to Mexico City, then they'll come back to Chicago or wherever they happen to live.
Maybe wondering if there are such problems in their own homes and so forth.
And expose them to that.
I would imagine too, especially with teenagers, that the trip itself, the long time spent on the bus or the plane, the kind of bonding that takes place has some value too.
Absolutely.
But isn't there some confusion there between what we do that's fun for us and what we do that's really helpful to others?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I'm most interested in exploring, both as one who continues to participate in some regard with short-term experiences, as well as one who's been somewhat critical, is, if we're honest, clearly it's as much about our own formation and development, and yet can you call that a mission trip? Is that driven by compassion and charity?
Right. Calvin College has what we call service learning. Many colleges have this now, and the understanding is that students who do volunteer work are doing service, but they also are gaining an education and cultural perspectives, and so it's very much understood that that they're receiving as much as they're giving, and that's part of the attitude. And you'd hope that would be the same with mission trips. I don't think I've ever heard a young person, and I am focusing on young persons, adults go on mission trips too, but I've rarely heard a teenager not describe such a trip as fun. And that's good in some ways, but it suggests that maybe the emphasis is not quite where it ought to be.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you've been interested in this because you've done it for a long time, and you've interviewed missionaries and hosts. You've read other researchers, gotten curious. First of all, let me ask, what started you doing short-term missions, and second, then, what has caused you to step back to take a look at it?
Yeah, I was one of those kids who grew up in the church early on saying, I know I want to be engaged in missions, and suddenly found myself as a youth pastor, and it felt like in order to be legitimate as a youth ministry, you have to do short-term missions. Plus, I felt like it was tapping my interest to somehow be engaged in what God is doing globally. So that was some of my own initial interest in doing it. I was doing that simultaneous with starting to do some research on it through some of my graduate work, and that was what began to expose to me, wait a second, what's going on here? And in particular, as I would compare the things that we as participants would say and what I heard the mainstream North American youth ministry rhetoric say about it, as compared to what I was hearing some of our brothers and sisters in local communities around the world who would receive them start to subtly imply about what was happening with them. So
give us some examples of that. What are some of the problems or the misperceptions about what's going on?
Yeah, I think increasingly I was hearing both from missionaries, but especially from non-Western pastors and local church communities. You have a sense that you've come here to help us and do this great thing. It's pretty well understood by us, they were saying, that we're here to serve your learning, not that you're really helping us in this short. Sure, maybe you're helping us put up a church or something, but don't overstate what it is you're really doing for us. So that would be an example. I mean, there's a interesting story I just heard about not too long ago from a group of Liberian pastors who described a group that wanted to come down and build a Christian school in Liberia. And of course, for any of us who have followed the atrocities that have happened in Liberia the last several years, who would not say, wonderful thing, education is a core aspect of what's needed. The concern was this American group came down and the Liberians said, you know what, if you could just help us raise some of the funds and help us think through a good plan for the school, we can build the building. Yeah. No, said the American group. We've done this all over the world. We know how to do this right. And as they came in, started building the building with some cautions, gently, graciously, as is typically the case in that kind of culture, saying, you know, we really wouldn't do it this way, but again, we're silenced by it. We have a more efficient way of building the building. Long story short is they built their efficient building without those inefficient practices of Liberian construction, but about a month later, the building came crashing down in the midst of a storm, injured significantly some children, and now there was a willingness to step back and say, maybe the Liberian way wasn't just a backward way.
Yeah. So there's a sort of arrogance sometimes about American missions. What are recipients of these mission trips? What are the hosts looking for really when they welcome these? Trips?
I think the thing that I hear again and again is just come do mission with us. You know, we're not saying we don't need you. We're not saying there's no place, but let's do mission together, whatever mission looks like, or service together. So don't objectify us. If you're going to paint a building, let's do it together. If we're going to go to the leper colony, let's go together. So I think that's one of the things.
Why do you think that doesn't happen more? It seems like an automatic, natural thing.
Yeah, it does.
It's not typical.
It's. As you know, Karen, it's such a complex thing. In part, I put more of the onus on the system of the church in the West that has said it's pretty hard to raise money for something that says we're just going to go down and do it with. So you have a much better cause if I say to you as a potential donor, if I don't do this, it's not going to happen.
Okay.
So that, I think that's a lot of what's
very
there.
Interesting. That we might be less willing to donate to your going down to assist. It sounds like you're just one of the gang, but if you're really in charge and you're the cause.
Right, show me the results.
Your book gets into 6 areas of conflicting perspectives, and you may or may not want to talk about all those, but for instance, time, how we view time, how we view money, how we view the Bible, that I think make it difficult sometimes. It may be easier to go down and do the job and go back to your own rooms at night and talk with your American friends about what you've seen than to really engage. I had a young friend a few years ago who, as a college student, decided to go study abroad, and she said she went to India. And I said, why India? And she said, it seemed to me to be the most uncomfortable situation I can imagine. In other words, it was a culture that seemed most different from my own, and I thought that I would grow the most that way. And I've rarely seen that kind of perspective. Why would you do that on purpose? But she knew she wanted to be stretched, and she went into a program where she didn't have much contact with other Americans. If you're not with other people like you, you're forced to immerse yourself in the culture.
Yeah, you are.
But we get these kind of superficial encounters on some short-term trips. So let's talk about time. What are some differences in perspectives about time, money, and so forth?
Yeah, I think the challenge is often, like you said, there's this superficial observation where we see things that look very familiar to what happens at home, and we assume they mean the same thing. So, you know, if time, an obvious one we always talk about with cross-cultural differences, if you show up late, then I automatically assume some things about you that you obviously don't have a great work ethic, etc. I mean, that's a fairly...
Or that I don't respect you.
Exactly. perhaps the comment I hear more than any other from short-term mission participants, especially coming back from the developing world, is those people are so happy. They have so little, but they're so happy. They're so content with so little. And there's one part of it that causes me to say that's a great thing for a Western consumeristic kid to see. There's another part of me that has said, are they? Are you so sure? And when you'll start to ask, why were they happy? Well, they nodded and they smiled at us a lot.
I wonder if people coming to visit the United States would be able to leave and say, gee, they have so much and yet they're so happy.
Yeah, well, it's a great point. I mean, or if you were to come into my home this evening, we don't know each other well, and I may have gone through the worst day of my life, but part of our social protocol is and you'd walk away and later find out I had an atrocity and say, wow, Dave is so happy. Maybe not. Maybe I'm just feigning. So I do think there's a sweet contentment we can learn from many of our fellow human beings in developing parts of the world, but let's be cautious. So that's maybe one of my greatest interest in that section on conflicting perspectives is there are things that we go in and we just look at what's on the surface, the top of the iceberg, if you will, and yet there are these profound differences that may be occurring.
Well, and it's very hard not to apply our standards.
It
I
is.
think that, education as a whole, I was telling you, when I teach medieval literature, I'm trying to get my students to try to make their minds medieval for a while, and rather than judging that other culture, to try to be part of it somehow. But it's a very hard thing to do unless, and you can't do this with medieval people, you can do it with people in other countries. You have to listen really carefully. That takes so much time and effort. Intention.
Yeah, and I often find, maybe you find it in literature as well, that sometimes the reverse response is then to deprecate all that's my own culture and to overreact. And I think the word that you used is key. No, it's more about listening and seeking to understand than necessarily saying, I have to treat time just the way you do, or I have to, but how do I understand how you view time?
Sure. Yeah, and I do struggle with that. I think it'd be very hard for me to give up my valuing of time. It does make the trains run, as we say. And,
Absolutely.
And, it seems to me to be a useful thing. And yet, so it's very hard for me to see that in a different way. Money, the value of money or the reason for money.
Yeah, this is so complex, and I think sometimes we go in with our good intentions to help. And I'm increasingly softening even in my sense of what the intentions and motives are of Americans who go. I think there's goodwill at the heart of it, but we don't seem to understand what us quickly saying, let me buy shoes for everyone in that village, does long-term for it. I share some illustrations in the book of a friend of mine from India, Ashish, who said to me one day, why does everyone think we're so poor? Why does everyone think we want what you know? There are some in the developing world who would say, bring it on, give me the car, give me the goods. But there are many who are saying, you know what, I'm quite happy being an African, being an Indian. Don't assume that my idea of contentment is having all the materialistic goods you do.
Okay. What about the behavior of mission teams when they go down? Does that create problems?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think referring back to an earlier comment that you made, that we rarely hear a young person, I would say adult as well, not describe their experience as fun, which one of the conflicting perspectives is so many of the people as part of the Christian church in other parts of the world who are going out in mission have this martyrdom syndrome of, hey, probably 1 out of 10 of us isn't going to live. So that very assumption in the first place of this is an adventure, let's go see, causes this behavior that ends up not necessarily being all that effective. Another thing that actually has some redemptive value from our own cultural value is the bottom line, let's get it done, let's go help, but can bring about problematic behavior in that, again, we're immediately wanting to fix the situation, but may not understand that if I'm in a certain part of the world, I just have to learn to cope. I can't always be fixing everything that comes alongside. So those are, there's the obvious ones of loud, brash Americans and those kinds of things, but as I talk with more and more non-Americans around the world, again and again I hear, we don't have a problem with the individual Americans we meet. It's the overall spirit of what you embody that is so affrontive to us.
I wondered about that. Might it be more effective not to send teams, but to send individuals, or to send teams down and break them up into separate homes and separate communities?
Yeah.
to be with families.
Exactly. I think it is that as much as a youth pastor, I loved having my team all stay together because we had some of the sweetest bonding times, but we missed out on what's the story that a family's going to share.
Sure.
And like I said before, it makes it very much of I'm serving you rather than how do we together
There's nothing
serve.
really, and I don't want to overgeneralize about mission trips, but often there's nothing particularly sacrificial about that project, right?
Yeah.
It really is. It's your spring break. Yes, you're
Right.
giving up your vacation, but...
And oftentimes other people are paying for you to get to go
Yes,
see the world.
sure,
That's the real challenge of it.
You talk quite a bit in your book about cultural intelligence, CQ, which is kind of a good buzzword, but and you describe it, I appreciated this, as culture being sort of the software that runs in your brain, that determines how you'll respond to activities. You had a friend who commented that Americans tend to come down, or mission groups tend to come down with just enough preparation to be dangerous.
Right.
What did he mean by that?
Right. Typically, the cross-cultural preparation that a group will do in trying to respond to some of the criticisms that I and others have raised would say, oh, we train our team. And training is important. The concern is if only training happens without some of the other facets that are involved in this field of cultural intelligence, it can make us more dangerous because suddenly now I can go to India like your friend did, and not to say that she did this, but I can suddenly look at it and say, I know Indian culture.
I know how to handle this.
Exactly.
Yes, I've been trained.
So that was kind of the core of what's behind that. But let us not throw the baby out with the bathwater and say that the training is unimportant. But cultural intelligence, I love it because it really is more of a transformational being approach to enculturating in different places rather than a behavior modification of I need to learn to say these things and act these ways and bow this way and then think. It's far much less about how can you get into the gimmicking, mimicking of what a culture does, but how is there this whole spirit of transformation that seeks to learn but is still true to who I am and isn't trying to be fake, that I would look ridiculous trying to do some of the customs of places that I've been.
What does that entail? What does need to change inside us before we can be open and receptive?
For one thing, I think we have to change thinking that the 2-week trip is going to change us, but see it as a curriculum that's part of a longitudinal process. So how do we see this long-term as yet another experience that is part of my journey in seeking to learn and develop? So that's one thing. I do think there's nothing wrong with me going down to share my spiritual journey, share my story, share my understanding of God's Word, but likewise, let me hear your story, let me hear your journey. So a collaborative sense of learning with one another.
We have an interview with someone that you referred to in your book who's done some research into that very question that we're going to watch now.
Great.
My name's Kurt Verbeek, and I've been working in Honduras for the last 20 years and for the last 10 with Calvin College running a semester abroad program. And living in Honduras for 20 years, I've seen lots of short-term missions groups come in and out. And I especially got interested after Hurricane Mitch, which was in 1998 in Honduras. And after Hurricane Mitch, hundreds of groups, thousands of short-term missions people came down, and made me curious about what the long-term impact of those groups were on both the communities they were helping, but also on the people themselves who went. We had a kind of a cool comparison on the Honduran side because we had almost 1,000 houses built by this organization, and about 70 of them were built by groups. So we could look at, were those 70 families different from the other 930 families, and were they better off? Were they, more of them had become Christians, they were more excited about their house, or were they worse off? Were the people, for some reason, more dependent, that they had to wait until North Americans came to fix their door or to fix their windows, or maybe they didn't value their house as much? So we had a natural control group which we were able to look at. On the North American side, we did something a little different too, in that we asked people, for example, what happened to their giving? Were they praying more when they came back? Were they volunteering more? But also, were they giving more? So people told us what they thought was true. And then we were able to compare that to the organization they went with, giving records, and look at, they say they were giving more, how were they really giving more, and what happened with all of that? So on both sides we were able to do something a little different from most of the studies. we started out asking the Hondurans basically, like, what do you think about your house? How do you feel about your house? How was the process? And if it was built by Honduran builders or the STM group, we would ask them, how did that all go? And in the end, everybody was overjoyed about their house. Some of the homes in each community were built by groups and some by the NGO, and there weren't any big differences between those. But this 2 or 3 long year relationship with the NGO was what made them feel happy. The people who were in these unmotivated communities said, the local organization is ripping us off, they're charging us too much interest, they don't give us any training, they didn't supply us with all the bricks they were supposed to. They were unhappy, not with the group, they were unhappy with this organization that had been in charge of this 2 or 3 year long process, which kind of just makes sense. I mean, it's not the people who are in our lives for a week, which usually change our whole outlook on things. It's those 2 or 3 year long relationships which help us change the way we think and see things. So then we asked for the giving records from the 17 churches who had sent these groups. And there was next to no change. And you also would hope that they had gone back to motivate their churches to give more money to this organization after a hurricane. They're doing good work, but their churches weren't giving more money either. Almost all of the North Americans said that one of the most important things from their trip was building relationships with Hondurans. And people would say it in all different ways, how important it was to meet people, working with them, that was the highlight of their trip, etc. And then we would ask them how many of them had stayed in touch, were maintaining that relationship. 74% said they weren't, which again is just sad. If that was the highlight of the trip, if that was the most important thing of the trip, to not invest in keeping that relationship up it makes sense. I understand it. I've done the same thing. But if that's what we're looking to get out of these trips, then that something's not working right. What I think will bring about long-term positive change for both Hondurans and for North Americans who participate in short-term missions is looking at it as maybe the second step in a much longer process. So before people go, both groups, the Hondurans and the North Americans, need to know why we're going is not so much what we do while we're together, but it's to build something on which we will commit to long-term goals together.
What do you think about Kurt's idea that these trips need to be step 2 in a 3-part process? How do you continue these relationships?
That gives me much more hope. If it truly is relationship, there's long-term aspect that's developed in that, where it's truly not coming down saying, we have this great plan of what we're going to do with you, but what, if anything, might we be able to do to serve you, and what is it that you can do to help serve some of our needs? So yeah, I think if we begin to look at these in terms of a long-term curriculum, that the next step to mission trip is not the 6-week debrief, though that'd be a great improvement on what happens for the most part, but what's the next 6-year plan look like? Right.
All right, so maybe long-term projects where maybe a group goes down every year for several years, or do longer trips make a difference if a group goes down for a month rather than a week?
Yeah,
Is that
I think you do see, while some of the same issues are there, a month, send some of the people from your community for 6 months, bring some of them here. Now sometimes that's not a wise decision, but sometimes bringing that community to meet a need that we have this end. I mean,
I wanted to ask about that. Can we be more creative and imaginative in recognizing ways that churches or groups here in the United States can benefit from what the groups we go to visit have to offer?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, increasingly, as we're becoming the minority church in the world, we have to think more creatively about what we have to learn from what it looks like for them to work out their theological understanding, their very practical understanding of the church. For example, one of the zealous reports I recently heard was somebody saying they were going to South India to present the most creative church planting program ever. And I looked at them and said, have you studied at all what's happening in church planting in South India? Yeah. Frankly, we need them to come here and train us. And there are a few instances where I've actually seen that happen. So yes, absolutely. We have to look at what are some ways that we can benefit from them as well as us them.
You ask why the takeaways are always the same sort of superficial things, right? What more can we hope for? Are there? Let me ask you though: are there some trips that are there some situations where manpower really is what is needed, and the warm body working next to me or working for me is the most important thing there is? In other words, do we need to choose our trips differently?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not ready to write off all physical labor trips. I think we have to ask some of the important questions like Kurt and Joanne do of, are we robbing the local economy of some things that would happen where we could send the money that our team is raising to actually help the local builders, a lot of what Kurt's study looks at. But yeah, I mean, in our own country, we've seen in the last year a huge number of domestic trips to Mississippi, New Orleans, etc., to try and, well, there's been some very tangible tasks that we can help with. So in some ways, I have more hope for that than let's just go down and evangelize those people in 5 days.
In the end, it really is finally about being willing to genuinely give ourselves, not just our time, not just our possessions, not just our money, but our whole selves, and also to receive other people.
Yeah, be willing to be served, which is a humbling thing.
Yes. My guest today has been David Livermore, Executive Director of the Global Learning Center at Grand Rapids Theological Seminary, and author of the book, Serving with Eyes Wide Open, Doing Short-Term Missions with Cultural Intelligence. I'm Karen Saupe. Thank you for watching Inner Compass.